Do you have the hope diamond that I could lick? Hey everyone, I'm Catherine, and this is Men Stuff, the podcast on man things.
But wait, you're not a man.
But who better to learn about man stuff than a woman? And today, I want to learn more about whiskey. And guess what? You're going to help me. Everyone, the person joining me today is my friend Billy, and he's an expert on cocktails.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I do love whiskey.
My guest, Billy, is a bartender, but he's not just any bartender. Billy has been head bartender for some of the most prestigious restaurants in Jackson, Wyoming, and he's currently in charge of a bar for a resort in the area. Billy, tell us more about your experience in that world and with whiskey.
When I moved to Jackson, I was given the responsibility of running a really prestigious place that had quite an immense whiskey list. And at the time, I just happened to fall into a passion of wanting to learn a lot about it.
I think it takes a certain kind of person to be presented with a huge whiskey list and not be completely intimidated by it. It sounds like when you were in that situation, you just dove right in.
What I primarily carried at that time was mostly bourbon. I'd say 80+% was bourbon, or at least American whiskeys. So it wasn't really intimidating.
My question was, how long have you been bartending?
I've been bartending consistently for 15 years. But in general, I started flipping burgers illegally at 13 at a racetrack. So I'm 43, so 30 years I've been in the industry.
So we have the right person here to talk to us today. Everyone, if you can't tell, especially with me, in honor of our topic, which is whiskey, we're doing a late night recording session of this podcast, and we both have cocktails to celebrate.
This is true. I'm actually drinking whiskey, though. What is in your glass, Miss?
I'm drinking tequila, the gift of the gods. So did you say you were drinking whiskey?
I currently am.
Which one are you drinking?
At the moment, I'm drinking Buffalo Trace. It's got the right mash bill that I think is very approachable to a lot of people in honor of what we're doing. We
want the inside scoop. We want your recommendations. We want to learn how to not embarrass ourselves when we go to order a drink. But I'm drinking tequila. Actually, I want to learn more about whiskey because I am intimidated by it. And frankly, I don't have the palate for it in the way that I really like tequila. But I'm thinking if I have a conversation with you. So before we get into the really meaty whiskey, Billy, do you remember how we met?
I possibly not forget, actually. At the time, I was at what's called the Snake River Grill. Catherine had come in. It was her birthday. She was here on business. She was here for a day. And turns out we're the same age. And we went to neighboring colleges. She went to Radford. I went to Virginia Tech. So we instantly had this great connection. And it was her birthday. She wanted to treat herself. But Catherine ordered very well. A great bottle of Nebbiolo, a handful of appetizers, an entree, dessert.
Correct. I did order every single thing on the menu. Thank you for saying that tactfully. Do you remember the other thing that I was doing in your restaurant that night, aside from eating everything in sight? It's okay. I'll remind you. I was looking for Harrison Ford.
Oh, wow.
Listeners, I need to level with you. I have a very big crush on Harrison Ford. And actually, I always try to wear a t-shirt to my podcast that mimics the theme. And I wore my Indiana Jones Chewbacca t-shirt.
Listeners, it's Harrison Ford as Dr. Jones riding a motorcycle with a sidecar with Chewie in the damn sidecar. Where'd you find that?
The internet. And thank you. No. When I received it in the mail a year ago, and I wear it a lot. I assumed that when I walked out of my door the first day, it would be a parade, and no one has ever commented on it.
You know that he calls me by my first name, correct?
He calls you by your first name.
He has.
Do you mean William or do you mean Billy?
He homie, my mother calls me William. The first time I met him, I was so busy that when I turned around, I didn't have time to be starstruck.
So, okay, we'll do another episode on him. Who is your big celebrity crush?
Lewis Hamilton's very high on my list of people.
Nice. All right, Billy. Again, we're not getting into the topic yet. I have a quick bartender's quiz for you. It's just 5 questions. Number 1, the biggest answer that everyone wants is do you see us? Like, if we're in a crowded bar, all we want is some booze and everyone is there. We're trying to get your attention. You're trying to sling some drinks. How much do you hate that?
I'm a bartender, first and foremost, and I'll use this analogy. You can teach a monkey how to make drinks. You cannot teach a monkey to not throw his feces around the room. Don't be a person that gets to the bar and waves the bartender down when they don't have an order together. And then when you look for payment in a busy bar, they're like, oh, wait.
I have to
Because
pay.
the whole transaction slows everything else down. And you wanted my attention. Somebody else obviously does. You're better off asking a question, in my opinion, than the very blasé or empty-handed question of what whiskeys do you have, when obviously they're displayed behind me behind the back bar. If you have a question about a bottle you've never seen before, I'm happy to engage about it.
Oh my God. So I've been behind someone at any restaurant with fast food, and okay, there's 3 people in front of us, and then there's 2 people in front of us, and then there's one, and then they go, and they haven't thought about what they're going to order in the entire 5 minutes we were standing there. And I'm like, what were you doing? So for you to be running a bar full of 30 different thirsty people, and someone finally gets their go and they don't know what they're doing, they can have another 20 minutes to think about it.
And I will move on in a heartbeat. So if you're waving cash, you get precedence. It's such a quicker transaction.
It works for everybody too, because if I would like a drink sooner and you would like to get on to the next client, everybody wins. You also killed me with the what whiskeys do you have? Because I malfunction as a human all the time. Who knows what comes out of my mouth? But in that case, you can't read their mind. Isn't a better question, do you have blank?
It's more so what are you usually into?
You do have a lot of knowledge. You know what all of those bottles back there mean and what's in them.
If you give me a baseline to work with, I've got you all day. We have a new guest. Do you have any Pappies? You can't get it at your liquor store in Texas? I sure am not getting it.
So we have a range of clients, is what I'm hearing, is we have the client who's like, do you have any alcohol at all that I could order? Then on the other side of the spectrum, someone's like, do you have the Hope Diamond that I could lick? What is the coolest drink to order, and what is the least cool drink to order?
Coolest, least coolest. Everything comes in waves, right? Everyone wants an old fashioned these days.
You know what? It's funny that you said that, because in my list of questions that I was writing for you, I had written if drinks come in trends, and then I deleted it.
Most certainly drinks come in trends. There's only 5 drinks essentially in the world. Everything else is Mr. Potato Head. A mojito is really a Tom Collins, and you put rum in, you put lime in instead of gin and lemon, but it's still the basic build. A gimlet is a daiquiri. A lemon drop martini is a sidecar. They're all the same build. And that's what makes good bartenders great. You can tell me what's in it. I know how those ingredients work together. I can almost nail the specs.
If I add sugar plus a fruit to this, and really there's only so many mixers and bases out there. Totally. And if it works for one, why would it not work for another?
It's not necessarily always Mr. Potato Head or plug and play, but it's bucket of parts, right?
Now I understand. I thought you meant it was just an idiot.
No, Mr.
Yes,
Potato Head is bucket of parts.
I love it. And very nicely dodged on the question, what's the coolest drink or the least cool drink? Billy has reminded us that there's really truly only 5 drinks you can order.
At the end of the day, say you live in Joplin, Missouri, right? You never saw Campari till last year. You've never had a Negroni. That shit hits for you. Rock and roll, have a Negroni, right? Get in there.
It doesn't matter if you're in Boise, Idaho. You can order an Aperol Spritz.
Okay, actually, I have a few wrongs. There's certain brunch drinks that, if you order a Bloody Mary, after dark, what is going on? That's just not something that my body even thinks about leaning towards at that hour.
I am so glad you said that.
I will make you one.
It should not be your evening cocktail. A Bloody Mary should not be your evening cocktail.
It should not be.
Don't order a Bloody Mary after 3 p.m.
If you're 45 and you order a Long Island, I'm like, oh, you're on a mission?
So, right. That's another one. Those are very bad habits. Sorry, listeners. This is why you're listening. We're helping you. Don't do those things. Don't order a Bloody Mary after 3 p.m. and don't order a Long Island after 25. And that's pushing it. So the last question I have is, what's the most ridiculous thing someone's ever ordered from you? And I'm going to tell a quick story because I've not been on that side of the bar ever, but I was at a bar, kind of a nice-ish bar at an upscale hotel in Denver. And I was going to order a martini or tequila or something. And the guy behind me ordered a Grey Goose and soda, but it wasn't a Grey Goose and soda water, which normally I drink Grey Goose and martinis, so I don't mix it with anything. But he wanted Coke, so he ordered Grey Goose and Coke. And I wasn't sure if he had just panicked or maybe that was his drink, but I thought it was a very obscure combination. what, Billy, is the most ridiculous thing someone's ever ordered?
I probably have a few, but the first one that comes to mind is very similar to like what you mentioned in the panic ordering. Because people panic order like Tito's and vodka. I'm like, what other vodka? What they want is a Tito's and soda, and I know this damn well. I know exactly what they want the moment Tito's comes out of their mouth. Like, y'all got Tito's? Yes, everybody does. But they're like Tito's and vodka. I'm like, I know what Tito's is, but what other vodka would you like? So they panic order
Bailey's and orange juice.
But wait, Bailey's and orange juice, like my brain's still going there. Like, how'd you think of that? That is absurd. I might actually walk off the job if I were to see that ticket.
If they were separate, totally fine, totally survival mode. I could order a shot of Bailey's and a shot of orange juice separately and was at breakfast brunch. Mixed together. Oh, I would love to see. Maybe you could put it in a nice champagne flute, like a mimosa.
I'm not sure if you can see my face at the moment, but like I'm almost ill.
In college at Radford, we could not afford Bailey's. And so we bought, it was called Ryan's Cream. It was called Ryan's Cream.
I would love to see their marketing campaign.
It was subtle.
No.
We're an hour into recording. Should we start talking about whiskey now? Billy, since you're the expert, can you please take a few minutes and explain to me what is the difference between whiskey, bourbon, and Scotch?
Most whiskeys are starting the same. You know, you're using a source of sugar. With whiskey, it'll be some sort of grain, corn, barley, rye, etc. But you're basically making beer out of that. You're making a mash, partially fermented grain. You know, you're extracting those sugars and turning it into alcohol with introduction of yeast, etc. And then where whiskeys diverge is what grain they use, how they're aged, and how they're distilled. So we'll start with American whiskey. Bourbon specifically has to be made with 51% corn. Your mash bill outside of that can vary any way you'd like it to. Mm-hmm. Irish whiskey, you're going to be using barley and typically using pot stills, which is a different style of still used in distillation, and aged, where Scottish whiskey is using barley, but you're malting it. But essentially, they're all the same. You're looking at distilling beer and then aging is essentially like the breakdown.
Truly, alcohol all starts the same. Totally. And for the sake of this part of the conversation, whiskey is alcohol made from a grain of some kind, whether it's barley, corn, wheat. And then you have bourbon, which has requirements. It has to be 51% corn. And then for my research, and you touched on this, I read that Scotch was 100% type of one grain, and I was hoping you could clarify it.
So single malt scotches, when they say single malt, so they're using one distillation for that bottling. So hence, it's a single malt. Doers, per se, or example, Johnny Walker, right? There's probably 40 different single malts, but that's why they call them blended whiskeys. So single malts are coming from one single distillation versus being blended.
That's super helpful. And for everyone listening, I just know this from my research. So I got a little cheat sheet. Malting is the process because grains are made up of sugar, but the sugars aren't readily available to be broken down and turned into alcohol. The malting process, and Billy has said mash a couple times, that is the process of preparing the grain in advance of that fermentation to make it as easy as possible to turn to alcohol.
Yeast eats sugar and, for lack of better nomenclature, poops out alcohol.
Yes. So that brings me to my next point. I was researching the origins of whiskey. And what I can find is that whiskey was invented in the early 1000s, but there's a little bit of a discrepancy if Scotland or Ireland was the one that invented it. We have two stories here. Both of them involve monks. The Irish story says monks were using distillation techniques to make medicines. That was the first whiskey. The Scottish story says that they were trying to make something similar to wine, but all they had was grain, so they just tried distilling that instead. Either way, somehow they both kind of came to market at the same time. Who do you think? Do you have an opinion here?
So it's going to stay within like the educated class, which was probably the priesthood at the time. So I'm not going to touch on that because honestly, like, who knows, right? Like, it was honestly, at the end of the day, it was probably pretty similar timing. Not knowing things is okay sometimes.
They probably invented it, and then they normally took notes every day, as you did back then. They took monk's log, but they got too wasted, 6 months later, we're like, we should write this down. We found the most amazing thing.
Irish is my favorite. I love Irish whiskey.
Oh, he went there. You hear that?
I did go there.
Scotland. It's okay. I don't have any listeners in Scotland.
I did go there.
Okay. Bourbon is exclusively made in the United States, according to the rules. Scotch is exclusively made in Scotland, according to the rules. So we have one of those exclusive regional alcohols. And the only ones that I could think of aside from that were Champagne and Malort.
Malort. I'm so happy you went there. But
oh, my Lord. Malort.
I love Malort, actually.
You have terrible taste.
It's just aquavit aged in wormwood barrels, really, at the end of the day.
They're horrible and should be thrown away at the end of the day.
Same thing with like Chicago-style pizza, that being said. I don't need your casserole.
So, Billy, there's a black sheep of the whiskey family that we have not talked about yet. Bourbon and Scotch are considered high-end affluent drinks, and this whiskey does not have that reputation. Call the Dukes of Hazzard because we're talking about moonshine, baby.
Oh.
So for everyone listening, moonshine is just unaged whiskey. And while it fits in with the whiskey family, I personally don't think it has that high-end reputation that the others do. For me, it fits in about as well as Happy Gilmore fits in on the Pro Golf Tour. However, I would like to read you this quote, Billy. Quote, "It's typically produced in small batches, in homemade stills, and is considered to be a very high-quality spirit." What do you think about that?
Moonshine is produced in small batches because it's backwoods stuff, you know. Like, at the end of the day, like, you're basically like coming out with a product that's like Everclear, right? You're talking about like 100% like green alcohol. Like, if cars were built differently these days, you could run a vehicle off that stuff, like city buses, everything, airplanes, whole nine. You know, like if you watch like videos of like people like working with like moonshine or say mezcal, like in the backwoods, because mezcal is really just the moonshine of Mexico. Right, like they're making it with like no flip flops on, just like out there in the woods. Like it's the same. Like it's.
I love that you said
incredibly rustic and beautiful. It's absolutely. Beautiful.
I love that you said with no flip flops on, as if that makes a difference. As if not having flip flops on makes a difference.
And we're talking like grain alcohol, no dilution, no aging. It's actually a really intriguing spirit because you're tasting exactly what they expected. It's what came off the still and that distiller's creative ability and his talent.
It's a very natural, authentic, basic way of creating alcohol. I did the exact same logical fallacy that you did in calling it a grain alcohol, because we've established earlier in this podcast that whiskey is alcohol made from grain. That's what it is. That's the definition. And I was so inclined to call moonshine grain alcohol, but not call whiskey grain alcohol when it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm really relieved to hear you do that too. So the small batch is very celebrated because you appreciate that attention to detail and you appreciate the process. People want that. They don't feel that mass-produced alcohol like Jack Daniel's has that much attention to it. So I think that this alcohol like has a reputation to break because like, look, could you imagine if James Bond had apple pie moonshine as his signature drink and he was freezing
that's going to change the context. Which Bond?
Any of them. If you imagine Sean Connery or Daniel Craig in Casino Royale with a mason jar of apple pie moonshine, he's less cool.
This son of a bitch didn't know what he was doing. He made it in his bathtub.
Also, the explosions that aren't doing moonshine any favors.
No, doesn't behoove like your HOA by any stretch.
And another thing that I think doesn't do moonshine any service is that there's 1,000 flavors. You know, banana and apple and creme brulee and vanilla, apple pie and caramel. I don't know. There's a million.
And like consumers, like those gimmicks get them. Peanut butter whiskey, screwball, like that shit sells like wildfire.
I like churros and I like vodka. So I'm going to like churro vodka.
I love churro.
I do too. You are so far from the Mexican border in Wyoming. I'm very sad for you.
No, I'm not. Most of my friends are Mexican. I'm good, homegirl.
You're still physically far from the Mexican border. I
break it down. That's a different conversation. You're not that much closer, sweetheart.
I'm an 8-hour drive closer.
An 8-hour drive based off roads. If I could fly directly to your house, it'd be like 200 miles.
Okay. Your
That's what I'm
point
saying.
has been pulverized and then deep
What?
fried and then
How
covered
far
in syrup and honey. This just in, Jackson, Wyoming is not far from Mexico.
Mexico does not even get close to the equator. We're going to edit this out, obviously, but this is a fun fact. Don't even touch the tropics.
Okay, mister, I see things as a map.
I do. I love maps.
You should look at one.
I should. Pensacola, Florida, and like Southeast Oregon are only 1 hour apart. Let's have a shot, and we'll get back on track and reset.
Perfect. Mine was caramel flavored Smirnoff, but I wish it was churro. So, Billy, now that we've talked about the differences between Scotch and bourbon and whiskey, and we've learned that they're all made by distilling grain, very simply, if you want alcohol, you need two main ingredients, yeast and sugar. And what differentiates liquors is what they use to get those sugars. For example, wine uses grapes, tequila uses agave, vodka uses potatoes sometimes, and whiskey uses grain. I have Googled and found the recipe to make whiskey. 3 steps: mash, fermentation, distillation. MFD.
100%.
MFD. Motherfucking doing it.
Excellent.
Let's go through step by step what each one means. The first step in the journey to booze is mash. This process is going to break down the starch before the brewing process and makes the sugars more readily available for the yeast to munch down on. Because the yeast eats up the sugars and poots out the alcohol, as we determined earlier. Once we've gotten the sugars all primed and ready, is fermentation. Fermentation is where yeast breaks down the sugar to produce alcohol. The yeast enzymes eat up the sugar, and the expelled result is alcohol. Sweet, glorious, beautiful alcohol.
Life finds a way.
Okay, so the last part of the alcohol process, which I use this as a common term, and I think that a lot of people don't understand exactly what it means because we just use distillation as a verb. But truly, what does that mean? After the mash and after the fermentation, alcohol has been produced, but the end result is very diluted. So what distillation means is they boil the fermented liquor and the vapors that contain alcohol separate from everything else. And the distillation process captures those alcohol vapors and then they allow them to turn back into liquid, which is a much more highly concentrated version than what they previously had. And it's more pure. So this distillation process is incredibly important. That's where we get the potency. Aging whiskey imparts different flavor characteristics. I would love to be able to go to a bar and order the most aged whiskey I can find because I assume that one's the best. But since my last name is not Benz or Bezos, what can we look for if we're trying to order a liquor? How do we navigate that?
So think about this barrel's breathing, number one. So when it's hot, it's expanding. It's sucking that whiskey into the barrel. As it cools through that diurnal shift, it's pushing that whiskey back into the barrel with whatever it pulled with it. It's this beautiful process. It's like an inhalation, exhalation. American whiskeys, if they're aged in a place that's seeing those extremes, 12 to 13 years is my magic window for me. I think after that, it starts to pick up too much wood.
Okay.
It just tastes like you're licking a tree.
Which is not like licking a Hope Diamond.
Moving forward from that, now let's look at Scotland, Ireland. Like, I'm not sure who's been there that's listening, but the weather's pretty lousy. Well, no, those inhales and exhales are now like not as extreme. It's not seeing those differences in temperature gradients. It is allowing those barrels to breathe as rapidly. So it's a matter of the environment in which it's aged and what the temperature gradients are. So now when you got a 50-year, say, single malt, someone's like checking in on it, like they're curating it. So from 12 to 13 years on American whiskey, Scottish whiskey, I love being in the 18 to 25 ballpark. Same with Irish whiskey, like that, like 18 to 25 is pretty stellar. There's so much in the market. And obviously, like all the brands that are out there that are staples, like Basil Hayden's, like Woodford, Makers, like they're tried and true for a reason. Consistency is one of the hardest things in this world to achieve. And for folks that are nailing it, hats off all day.
Billy, do you like peanut butter whiskey?
I love peanut butter and jelly, peanut butter whiskey. I don't have time for it.
Billy, thank you so much for your insight today. It has been so much fun learning about what I should and should not do at the bar, first of all. And then also your very deep insight into whiskey and liquor in general has been really amazing. I feel a lot more confident ordering whiskey at a bar, and I'm kind of excited to give it a try. Maybe I'll give tequila a little backseat and go for whiskey next time. I'm not so intimidated now.
Just don't be gun shy. If you have questions, ask. Like, if you have questions, ask. Like, your bartender, if they're good at what they do, should be elated to have someone that's actually thoroughly interested.